This is an oral history interview conducted for the Witness to War Serving a Nation project at Nauset Regional High School on Cape Cod, Massachusetts. For the sake of this interview, please state your full name and community in which you now reside.
John Leslie Moore, Harwich, Massachusetts.
What was your childhood like?
I was born in Lynn, Massachusetts, moved to Melrose, and went through junior high school in Melrose. Moved to Rhode Island, Florida, Providence, Rhode Island, below Providence, and then went to college beyond that point. My growing up period was excellent. Contrary to present daytime situations, my mother did stay home and be sure that I behaved myself. My dad worked for the General Electric Company in Boston originally when I was growing up in Melrose, and he was transferred to Providence, Rhode Island, and that's where I completed my high school. I had one of my grandfathers had a farm in Ellenville, New York, and I spent a fair amount of time in summers out there in the 1930s. And both he and his wife, my grandmother, became very favorite friends as well as relatives. And actually, if I were to summarize my upbringing, I worked hard. I was motivated to study hard and not play on time that should be devoted to other things. And I look back on it as a very pleasant time.
Okay. Where did you live when you were a child?
When I was what?
Where did you live majority of your childhood?
Okay, I didn't get the last word.
Where did you live majority of your childhood?
Oh, childhood. That's a good question. The majority of it would have to be in Melrose Highlands, Massachusetts.
Okay.
What schools did you go to?
I graduated from high school in Melrose, Massachusetts. No, I didn't. I'm sorry. I graduated from Cranston. I lived when my father went to and changed his job to Warwick, Rhode Island. He got me into the Cranston school system there in Rhode Island. So I graduated from Cranston. Went from Cranston to Bates College in Lewiston, Maine for 4 years. Graduated there with a BS in biology and chemistry, and was accepted to the Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center in New York City in 1952 for 4 years of medical school, where I graduated in June of 1956.
Why did you want to join the service?
I joined the service for two very practical reasons. I became a member of a new program that was called Ensign 1995, in which I could enlist and become an ensign my last year of medical school. And for practical purposes, I was paid as a full-time ensign after I was initiated into that program, and got subsistence, which paid for our home and so forth. And I already had my oldest son at that particular time. My second son, who you now know on the Cape, in fact, you may know both of them. But Steve was born in New York City at the Columbia Presbyterian Hospital. And then my daughter, who presently lives in O'Fallon, Illinois, was born in the Naval Hospital at Bethesda, Maryland, where I took my internship in 1957.
What did you think was the most interesting part about what you did in service? Like the most interesting thing that happened to you?
Just as kind of a preliminary thing without being too wordy, hopefully. Uh, I went into the Navy as a physician. My first job was to go through Pensacola, Florida, through the flight surgeon school there, and went from there as a flight surgeon at the Marine Corps Air Station in El Toro, which is in California. And at that time, I had an opportunity to go back in through flight training. The Navy at that time had 3 or 4 physicians who also were trained as pilots, and for both research purposes and for training purposes. So after 2 years with the Marines in El Toro, I went back to Pensacola, Florida. I went through the flight training program and graduated out of there and was sent to a fighter training program called squadron that was called VF-121 in Miramar, California, and spent 3 years there, basically as a learning tool as well as a training tool for radar operators on the F4, which is that FAR model that's right there, and flew the F3 here also. And then in 1962, I was transferred from there to the Patuxent Naval Test Center, which is in Lexington Park, Maryland, where I did strictly research in aviation medicine and a lot of research in programs that I was previously familiar with when I was flying on the West Coast.
What was the most challenging part of your service?
The most challenging part was probably that part of the research work that I did when I was at the test center involved flying a jet, and you can see that on the table right over there, in what are called parabolic curves up to 80,000 feet. And actually I had more time at that particular point in time. I had more time in low stratosphere flights than the astronauts had, because they hadn't really gotten started at that particular time. What was exciting about that was that I was testing pressure suits. Now, pressure suits were designed primarily for wearing in an airplane that might lose its pressurization system, like you might in your airliner. If you lost your pressurization above 55,000 feet, because a human being can't survive in those situations. So I would go up to try to get as close to 50,000, 80,000 feet as I could, and then I would depressurize the cabin. Now the suit had already been tested, so there probably wasn't much danger, but to make a long story short, what you were basically doing is subjecting yourself to the outside atmosphere, which was at 80,000 feet. I had several close calls in flying that you might want to hear about it if you want me to mention them, which were a little more hair-raising than that, because the ones that occur as near accidents occur without planning. You hope that your education and your smarts gets you through it, but you don't have a chance to plan it like you do the full pressure suit flights that I took.
If you're comfortable, would you mind telling us about the near experiences?
Yes, I was on my way into Miramar at one particular time, and this F4, which is the Phantom, which was built by McDonnell, I was probably about 5 miles to the northeast of there, and I didn't hear an explosion, but the engine suddenly started, the left engine started doing things that it really shouldn't do. And when that happened, I immediately shut down the engine, because it's a 2-engine airplane, and I was very, very close. So I just shut it down. Once the engine stopped turning, everything got a little bit quieter, and I went on in and made an immediate landing. And when I got on the ground, the operations officer and the maintenance officer came up and said, "What did you do to our airplane?" And what had happened was that the left engine had thrown a turbine blade, and a turbine blade is the back portion of the jet engine. It had thrown a turbine blade, and the turbine blade had come out through the side of the airplane and blown a hole about 8 inches in diameter in the side of the airplane. Now, where the problem came was that if that turbine blade had exploded out the other side, which was toward the center of the airplane, that's where the fuel was kept. And I had about 10,000 pounds of fuel in that, and it would have blown up immediately. And the only other one that was really close to that sort of a thing was on one of those high altitude flights that I mentioned to you. On the way back, I had lost part of the hydraulic system that controls the airplane, but the other part of it was working fine. So I called in and told them what my problem was and started down. It takes a little while to get down from 80,000 feet, and I was already halfway, about 30 miles beyond Norfolk, Virginia, because that's the track I'd taken to do the experimentation. And on my way down, I lost the hydraulic pressure, which was fine because I had a second system. And I always questioned until I got down on the ground why everybody was kind of quiet when I told them what was happening. Came back, made a normal landing, no problem. And the first thing that happened was that the commanding officer showed up and he said, "How are you doing?" And I said, "I'm doing fine." And I said, "Why is everybody so quiet around here?" And due to some problems with a piece of equipment in which both of those hydraulic control systems were fitted, the last 2 people that had had a failure in the hydraulic system had to eject because they lost total control of the airplane. And they didn't know whether I knew that or not, which I did not. And they probably felt that it was probably just as well that I didn't know it, because that would maybe cause more anxiety than not. So those are probably the only 2 events that could have been a major problem. But I learned a long time ago when I started flying that I may not go to church every Sunday, but that I do have a guardian angel, and that's why I'm sitting here today, because there were several others that weren't quite as exciting. But it's things that you handle as best you can, and you hope that your training has had the experience. One of the things I learned a long time ago is that if you've had all the experiences, that's why you're still alive. And if you haven't gotten to that point yet, that's why a lot of very, very smart people who've had good training end up dying prematurely, because they didn't have it long enough to do it. So look at it that if you drive your car properly every time, you don't take chances, and you learn, then you're probably going to live a long time without crashing your automobile.
Did you ever get homesick?
No, I don't think I had. Like my father, I was very much oriented toward working hard, and when I got ready to go off to college, I was looking forward to a new experience. And the same thing happened when I made my choice to go to medical school, and flying in the Navy was such that by that time I had a wife and family, and kids were coming, and I really didn't have a chance to get homesick. It was not an experience that I could even relate to you at this point.
What was it like when you came home for the first time?
What was it like?
What was it like when you came home for the first time?
I got out of the Navy, and actually at that particular time, I got a job at the McDonnell Aircraft Corporation. It was actually the manufacturer of both of these airplanes that I flew in the military, and worked in there. Was their flight surgeon for the company. Also worked in the human factors program, and I enjoyed St. Louis. The family was complete at this time, and my daughter, by the time we got there, was just a baby. We had the fun and responsibility of not being able to get our furniture because the driver of the van got a bleeding ulcer. We had to live in a motel for 4 weeks. So the kids all started schools and living in one room that's probably about the size of the room we're in right now wasn't particularly enjoyable, but it was a new job. And wife was happy, the kids were happy, and from there, I actually, with the family, moved here to Chatham. And I'm talking 50, 55, 56, 57 years ago. There's nobody here anymore, except maybe in nursing homes that I remember from the old days, but I know the names. It was a very welcome experience. I actually practiced medicine here for about 4 years before I moved to Florida. So you get used to, if you've been able to be reasonably successful, you get used to letting the things that might annoy you just not annoy you. I think it's a lifelong thing that is important. And in the military, what you learn is that you do the best you can. You always give advice to those who are senior to you, but once they say that they're going to make the decision, you say yes, sir, and you sit back and you don't argue. And I've seen that rule changed by years since then, and I still think it's a good rule. It doesn't lead you to much unhappiness, that is.
What was the most interesting place you went during your service?
That probably would be the Patuxent Naval Air Station, which is where the Naval Air Air Test Center is. I was actually in a section of that was called service tests, so we had the responsibility of doing tests on brand new airplanes that are being looked at by the Navy with the idea of buying for the service. And I had already had an opportunity to, during my training on the West Coast, to get 100 day and night carrier landings. So I'd been out in the middle of the night landing off at all these airplanes. But the test center was exciting because there was a lot of new things that were being done. It was from the test center where I ran those high altitude flights, and the pickup system that the Air Force started and the Navy picked up later on, where you can fly an airplane over and pick a man up off the water or pick a man off the ground. When I got to the test center, I became in charge of that test program, which was interesting. When you think of it, you fly an airplane at 100 and whatever the airplane is, but you fly an airplane at say 300 to 400 feet over a man that's sitting with a harness and a cable that goes to a balloon, and the airplane picks up that whole thing and then picks him up and pulls him to the airplane, and he gets in the airplane and then comes back in the normal way. That system was used many times in Vietnam, for example, as a way to pick up individuals that were caught either having ejected from airplanes or having been lost in the jungles and could be found, and you can pick somebody up from even in a tree population, because when the airplane goes by, if you use a nylon rope, the nylon rope doesn't pull you immediately toward the airplane. As the nylon rope expands and the airplane takes over the weight of the person actually goes off the ground straight. And then you move the higher you get to the rear of the airplane. So that program was used quite a bit.
What was the most fun thing you experienced in your service?
Good question. The most fun thing. Well, I guess probably the most fun thing is to be in an airplane and to get fired off of an aircraft carrier. I'm actually old enough that I would have used a carrier that had what are called hydraulically operated catapults. When the steam catapults came in later on, which were the majority of my catapulting, when those came in later on, you went from 0 to about 160 miles an hour gradually in about 3 to 5 seconds. And that was like being on a roller coaster. The hydraulic catapult, though, however, did not have that elongation of the stroke. And when that fired, you went immediately, as much as the weight of the airplane would allow you, but you basically, before you even knew where you were immediately up to the speed at which you were going to be launched. And that was a kick. The catapult, the arrested landing is, you're actually working the other way around, but you're going, depending upon the airplane, generally you're going from something like 150 or 160 miles an hour down to 0, but you've got about 300 to 600 feet to do it. And that is a gradual decrease in speed, so I wouldn't say that's quite as exciting.
What do you think is the most important lesson you learned while in the service?
I think the best lesson I ever learned, because I did a lot of teaching, and I've told this so many times to people that I talked with, so I might as well tell it to you, is that there will be times in your lifetime that you will be given, particularly even if you work for yourself, but let's say if you work for somebody else, and this happened in the military, you're going to be given a job that you're not going to like. And I learned very, very early that if you take that job, you may not have a big smile on your face, but you take that job with a smile on your face, and you do the very best job that you can do in that job, you will be rewarded for it later. Because the military in particular, and people in general, which is military is made up of people, they respect a person who doesn't moan and groan all the time, and who takes that responsibility of a lousy job well and does a good job. And you will find that, and I found that the people who did that were rewarded. Because when the good jobs come up, somebody says, who are we going to give the good jobs to? Well, that guy over there just had the lousiest job in the world, and look at the fantastic job that he actually did. So I think it's a matter of building character and realizing that nobody can ask you to be perfect, because none of us are. But if you have a chance to do something that you maybe don't like, but do it well, you
Knowing what you know now, would you still join the service?
By all means. I would have stayed in the service. I met a lot of people, and I had a lot of relationships that I could have lived and retired out of the military service. But there were several reasons that I got out at the end of 9.5 years. And one of them was because both my boys, who were the fellows that are living here in the Cape right now, both my boys were teenagers. And I was going to have to go aboard ship as a senior medical officer on tours, which would have been, overall, would have been 4 years long, with something like 6 months at sea, 6 months home, 6 months at sea, 6 months at home. If you look back in the records of some of the times that these carrier groups spent around both the Afghanistan and the Iraq War, they oftentimes went up to 8 or 9 months. And that, coupled with the fact that I got into a little bit of an argument with the admiral at the test center, because his best friend was the senior medical officer who ran the dispensary at the test center, and he needed doctors to help out. So I found myself working nights at the dispensary to try to help him work out, and then the next day I would go to 80,000 feet to run tests, and I couldn't get any response from that. So I decided I would get out. And interestingly enough, I got out, but 6 months later, the fellow who took my place wrote me a letter and said, the Navy changed the policy. That'll never happen to anybody who's in that job again. But those are the things that you accept. I don't regret that I made the decision to get out on that basis. I can look back and say, yeah, I could have, I think, done well, but it's like everything else. As you get older and you get up in rank in the Navy, particularly past the age of 45, you're not going to fly anymore. And the flying was definitely a major part of what I did and what I enjoyed.
How has your life changed after serving in the military?
Well, this is hard to say, because you like to think that the major avenue of progress in growing up is becoming more mature, and I always have a hard time defining what that word means. But I think what I learned and what I got out of it was a way to. The military is an organized, stratified system, and it teaches you to organize the things you do and the things that you don't do. And I think one of the things that I learned was the capacity to do that. And I would like to think that I have been as successful outside of the Navy afterwards as I was while I was in.
Who were your closest friends in the military, and are you still in touch with any of them?
I was fortunate enough to become an honorary member of a group of naval and marine aviators called the Golden Eagles. And they, at the time they were installed in the organization, of which there were only 200 members. They were all people who were senior officers who had contributed something to benefit the Navy and to benefit the service. And my boss at that time wanted me to get into the program. I was a medical officer, and therefore not in the standard Navy, and they wouldn't let me go in with the real troops, but they were willing to accept that I'd been part of a lot of changes that had improved the service, and made me an honorary member. And I'm not sure, as my memory gets poor as I grow older, did I really answer your question? But that was, oh, I was talking about the people. Had a lot of friends. I'm within 4 months now of 88, and a lot of my friends, the ones who were the closest to me, are no longer alive. And I had a father who died at 99 in 6 months, and one of his greatest, not concerns, but the thing that bothered him the most was that all of his friends, nobody lives, a few. You can see him in the newspaper, see him in the Cape Cod Times every Sunday morning. But you have to accept the fact that a lot of people who meant something to you will be gone. And I think that the time that was most demonstrable to me was that I left the Navy just about at the end of the Vietnam War, and 10 of my best friends, many of whom myself and my wife at that time played bridge with and got to know very, very personally, died in the Vietnam War. 2 of them were physicians who went out in helicopters to rescue pilots and never came back. That was probably the worst part of that sort of thing. To answer your question directly, right now, the last person I did make contact with up until about 4 years ago has passed on, and I don't think that any of my old friends are still around.
Why did you choose to live on Cape Cod?
That's an easy one. I came here, as I said earlier, at about 55, 56 years ago. And primarily, I knew the Cape because I'd been here in the summertime, and I lived in Massachusetts, born and lived here. But my parents had bought a house in Harwichport. And while they were here, they also moved to another house that my dad had built in Brewster. And they were becoming older. And it just got to the point that I felt that I wanted to come and at least be closer to home. And that's what I did. When I left here, about 1972, I would say, I'd never been back until just 2.5 years ago. And I was living in outside of Springfield, Missouri then at that particular time. And I had developed a couple medical problems that weren't going to allow me to live to be 100 like my father was. And I figured, now, if you had a chance, where would you go to spend the rest of your life that you enjoyed? And I thought, well, it's the Cape. And it just so happened that my son Steve had bought this house in a ramshackle condition, rebuilt it, and said, you pay me rent and you can stay here. And that's the house that you're in right now. So the return to the Cape, it was not easy in the sense that, be very careful, and this is just advice, free advice to everybody who's in the room. Be careful about going back to something that you remember as being particularly nice. Because it never is, because the time changes, and the people changes, and the circumstances change. But I spent a lot of hours driving around the Cape, and a lot of weekends seeing an awful lot of people, and of course during the summertime, I was in the Chatham Medical Group, we were pretty busy. I got to like the Cape just because of what it was, and I actually got hepatitis here, and went to work and became a professor at the community college, and was head of the Allied Health Services branch for 2 or 3 years before I left the Cape. And that was a learning experience, which I'd always look forward to. So, to sum it up, I like the Cape. It's a nice place to be.
Okay, thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
You're welcome. Did I have a feeling, because I don't talk to anybody but that dog most of the time, and maybe when my sons show up, but I didn't talk too much, did I?
No.
No,
Oh,
it was perfect.
Okay.